The hammer came down on the auctioneer's makeshift podium with a crack that echoed through the dusty main street of Caldwell, Kansas, and Lenora Boone felt the sound settle somewhere deep in her chest like a stone dropping into still water, because she knew that after today, there would be nothing left to sell. It was the autumn of 1879, and the town of Caldwell sat at the edge of everything. The last real settlement before the Cherokee Strip stretched southward into wild, uncharted country. The cattle drives still rumbled through here like seasonal storms, and the saloons never truly closed, and the air always carried the mingled scents of horse sweat and prairie grass and wood smoke. It was a town that chewed people up and occasionally, if you were lucky, spat you out with something resembling dignity. Lenora Boone was 26 years old, and she had not been particularly lucky. She stood at the edge of the small crowd that had gathered in front of Hartwell's General Mercantile, where old Silas Hartwell ran his informal auctions every third Saturday of the month. People brought things they couldn't use any more: farm equipment, furniture, livestock, occasionally personal effects when times turned truly desperate. Lenora had attended these auctions before, always as a bystander, sometimes as a quiet observer who could see the desperation behind a person's careful smile when they handed over something they loved. She had never imagined she would be standing here on this side of things, clutching a small velvet pouch that held the last piece of jewelry she owned in the world: her mother's cameo brooch. It was an oval piece, carved from shell, depicting a woman in profile with a delicate neck and hair swept up in the style of an earlier era. The frame was gold, real gold, though not a great deal of it, and on the back was engraved in tiny, precise letters, "For my Eleanor who holds the morning." Her grandmother had given it to her mother, and her mother had given it to her the week before she died of fever 4 years ago, pressing it into Lenora's palm with a grip that was both fierce and frail at once. Lenora had not touched it since placing it in the velvet pouch. She had not been able to bring herself to wear it, and she had refused, month after month and year after year through progressively worse circumstances, to sell it. But now there was the matter of the bank note. $340. That was what she owed to the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell, and if she did not produce it by the end of the month, which was 11 days away, she would lose the small house on the eastern edge of town that her late husband, Daniel Boone, had purchased 2 years before his death. Daniel had died of a riding accident in the spring of 1877, leaving her with the house, a half-broken-down mule named Chester, a modest vegetable garden, and a debt she hadn't fully understood until the bank's representative, a thin-lipped man named Archibald Prout, had appeared at her door 6 months ago with a ledger and an expression like cold dishwater. She had sold the furniture first, then the mule, then the gardening tools because she could use her hands without them, though it made the work harder. She had taken in laundry and mending, had worked 3 days a week at the kitchen of the Drover's Rest Hotel, scrubbing pots until her knuckles cracked in the cold air. She had saved everything she could, had eaten less than she should have, had patched the holes in her boots rather than replace them. She had come up, after all of that effort and sacrifice and grinding daily discipline, to $280, $60 short. The cameo was her mother's. It was also, according to the jeweler in town, worth approximately $70 to $90 if sold to the right buyer. She had told herself, climbing out of bed this morning in the gray pre-dawn light, that her mother would have understood. Her mother, who had been a practical woman from Ohio who believed that sentimentality was a luxury you paid for with action, would probably have told her to sell the brooch 2 months ago and stop being dramatic about it. She was almost certain that was true. She was almost certain that Silas Hartwell, a broad-shouldered man with a white beard that made him look perpetually like he was about to offer someone a piece of hard candy, spotted her at the edge of the crowd and raised his eyebrows in a way that was kind rather than intrusive. She had spoken to him yesterday, had explained the situation without going into the kind of detail that would make her cry, and he had agreed to include the brooch in the auction. He had also, quietly, suggested she set a reserve price so it couldn't sell for less than $60. "That way you protect yourself, Mrs. Boone," he had said, his voice low and without any particular judgment. "You'll get what you need minimum." She had set the reserve at $65, which felt like the right amount of terror. Now she watched the auction proceed through 3 farm tools, a rocking chair with a replaced runner, and a very opinionated rooster that nobody seemed to want, until a farmer's wife from outside town finally bid $4 and looked satisfied with herself. The crowd was moderate in size, maybe 30 or 40 people, a mix of townspeople and the occasional drover who happened to be passing through. Caldwell sat right on the Kisham Trail, and drovers were a constant presence from spring through fall, men who worked cattle north from Texas, and sometimes stopped here to resupply or simply to stand on solid ground for a day and remember what it felt like. It was because of the drovers that Lenora first noticed Frank Bancroft. He was standing at the back of the crowd, slightly apart from the main group, leaning against the hitching post in the particular way that tall men lean with one shoulder dropped and his weight shifted, as though he was considering whether the ground deserved the favor of supporting him. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two more, with dark hair that was a little longer than was strictly fashionable, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved with decisive, unhurried cuts. He wore the clothes of a working cowboy, practical canvas trousers, a dark shirt that had been mended at one elbow, boots that were well worn but well cared for, and a hat with a brim that had seen significant weather. He was watching the auction with the specific kind of attention that suggested he was not particularly interested in buying anything, but was genuinely curious about people. Lenora noticed him because he was looking at her. Not in the way that men in rough frontier towns sometimes looked at young widows, which was a look she had learned to identify and deflect with the efficiency of long practice. He was looking at her the way a person looks at a painting they haven't made up their mind about yet, thoughtfully, with a kind of quiet consideration. When their eyes met, he didn't look away immediately or with embarrassment, but he did give a very slight nod, the kind that acknowledged the meeting without demanding anything from it. She looked back at Silas Hartwell. "Next item," Silas announced, holding up the velvet pouch with the careful respect he gave all things that clearly mattered to someone, "is a lady's cameo brooch, gold-framed, shell-carved, in excellent condition. Starting bid is $65. There was a murmur through the crowd. $65 was not a trifling opening bid for a Saturday auction in Caldwell, and several people who had been watching with casual interest seemed to recalibrate their attention, either toward the brooch or toward Lenora, trying to figure out which one of these things was the more interesting story. A man near the front, Porter Wilkes, who ran the dry goods store adjacent to Hartwell's, raised his hand. "65, he said, which was technically just meeting the starting price, not exceeding it. "65 to Mr. Wilkes," Silas confirmed. A woman in a yellow bonnet bid 68. A cattle buyer named Reeves, who was in town for the season, bid 70, mostly, Lenora suspected, out of general acquisitiveness rather than any need for a cameo brooch. The bidding moved slowly and then seemed to stall around $72, which Porter Wilkes reclaimed with a flat, businesslike expression. Lenora looked at the velvet pouch in Silas's hand and thought about her mother's handwriting in the family Bible, the particular slant of her letters, the way she had always written Lenora's name as though it was something worth taking care with. $72 would cover the remaining 60 she needed, with $12 left over. It would be enough. It would be enough, and that was what mattered, and she should feel relieved, not as though someone had their hand around her heart and was squeezing. "Do I hear 75? Silas asked pleasantly. Silence. "Going at 72 to Mr. Wilkes, then. Going once, $100. The voice came from the back of the crowd, and it carried without effort, clear and unhurried. Every head turned. Lenora turned too, and found Frank Bancroft pushing off the hitching post, his right hand raised in an easy, almost casual gesture. The crowd made a collective sound that was half surprise and half the particular appreciation that frontier people had for dramatic gestures, because life out here was hard and dramatic gestures were entertainment. Silas Hartwell looked as though someone had just offered him a gift. $100 from the gentleman at the back. Do I hear 105? Porter Wilkes turned to look at the man behind him, seemed to make some rapid internal calculation about whether a cameo brooch was worth getting into a bidding war with a stranger over, and shook his head almost imperceptibly. The woman in the yellow bonnet looked interested for a moment, then reconsidered. Going at $100, Silas said. Going once, going twice. He brought the hammer down, sold to the gentleman at the back. Lenora was aware that her hands were clasped very tightly in front of her because she could feel her own fingers pressing against each other. $100. She would pay the bank. She would have money left, not much, $40, but enough to buy food for 2 months if she was careful, enough to feel the particular slow relief of a fear that had been released. She watched Frank Bancroft make his way through the crowd to where Silas stood at the podium, watched him count out bills from a worn leather billfold with the calm, unhurried manner of a man paying for something at a hardware store. He was taller than she had realized from across the crowd. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a shade of brown that was almost amber in the afternoon light, and that there were fine lines at their corners from years of squinting into prairie sun. He took the velvet pouch from Silas with a careful grip, turned it once in his large hand, and then looked around the crowd until he found her. She was watching him. She hadn't meant to be watching him quite so openly, but she was. He walked directly to her. The crowd was already dispersing, moving on to the next item on Silas's list, a serviceable spinning wheel that drew considerably more practical interest, and so there was a small island of relative quiet around them as he stopped in front of her. He was perhaps a foot taller than she was, and he held the velvet pouch out to her without any preamble. "Ma'am," he said, "I believe this belongs to you." Lenora stared at the pouch in his outstretched hand. Then she looked up at his face, trying to determine whether she was correctly understanding what was happening. "You just paid $100 for it," she said. "Yes, ma'am. And you're giving it back?" "Yes, ma'am." There was no performance in his manner. He wasn't making a show of this, wasn't looking around to see who was watching, wasn't wearing the expression of a man who expected applause. He was simply standing there with the pouch extended, waiting. "I don't understand," Lenora said, which was honest. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one warm around the edges. "You needed the money," he said, "but I don't think you needed to give this up to get it." "You don't know anything about what I need," she said, and she hadn't meant it to come out sharp, but it did, because she was suddenly aware that her eyes were stinging, and she was deeply unwilling to cry in the middle of Caldwell's Main Street over a cameo brooch in front of a stranger who had apparently just spent $100 to make her feel precisely this way. "No, ma'am," he agreed, without offense. "I don't, but you're welcome to it regardless." She took the pouch from his hand. Her fingers brushed his palm in the transfer, and she pulled back perhaps a half-second too quickly, then stood holding the velvet in both hands and looking at it rather than at him, because she needed a moment to get her face in order. "I can't accept charity," she said. "It's not charity," he said. "I attended an auction, made a bid, and gave my purchase to whoever I chose. That's commerce. That's a very creative interpretation of commerce." "I've been known to be creative," he said, and this time the suggestion of a smile did reach his eyes. "Frank Bancroft, pleased to meet you." She looked up. He had his hat in his hand, she realized. He had removed it at some point without her noticing, which was a piece of old-fashioned courtesy that she had not seen from a man in longer than she could immediately recall. "Lenora Boone," she said, and she reached out and shook his hand, which seemed like the thing to do, and he shook hers as though she were a person of equal standing rather than a widow he'd just performed an act of extraordinary generosity toward. "Mrs. Boone," he said, "are you all right?" It was such a plain question, and asked with such genuine plainness, that it undid something in her chest that had been tightly wounded for a very long time. "I will be," she said. "Thanks to you I will be. She stopped, took a breath, tried again. "Thank you, Mr. Bancroft. I don't know how to adequately express. I don't have any means to repay. I'm not looking for repayment," he said. He settled his hat back onto his head and gave her a look that was steady without being intrusive. "I hope whatever trouble you've been in eases up, Mrs. Boone." He nodded once, turned, and walked back toward the hitching post where a good-looking bay horse was tied, and Lenora stood in the dispersing crowd holding her mother's brooch and watching him go, and felt something she could not immediately name settle over her, like the particular quality of light that comes just before sunset, when everything is warm and gold, and exactly as long as it can be before the dark arrives. She went to the bank the following Monday morning. The First Territorial Bank of Caldwell occupied a solid brick building on the corner of Main and Second, and it smelled of paper and ink and the particular mustiness of old ambition. Archibald Prout met her in the small office he occupied near the back, with his ledger open in front of him, and his expression carefully neutral in the way of a man who had delivered enough bad news to have learned how to hold his face while doing it. Lenora placed $340 on the desk in front of him in neat, counted bills, and watched his expression shift from neutral to something that was very nearly respect, or at least a grudging revision of his prior estimate of her. "That clears the balance," he said, counting it himself, which she had expected. "In full," she confirmed. "There will be a receipt." He wrote it out, signed it, handed it to her. She folded it carefully into her small handbag. She thanked him without warmth and walked back out into the October sunshine, and she stood on the bank steps for a moment and let herself breathe the way she hadn't been able to breathe in 6 months, fully, without the specific tightness of financial terror pressing on her lungs. The house was hers. Whatever else was wrong or uncertain or difficult, the house was hers, and she would find a way to keep it. She was thinking about all of this, and specifically about the fact that she needed to return to her work at the Drover's Rest, and that she had mending to finish for 3 different customers, when she rounded the corner of 2nd Street and nearly walked directly into Frank Bancroft. He caught her by the elbow with reflexive steadiness, just enough to stop her stumbling, and released immediately once she'd found her balance. "Mrs. Boone," he said, with the particular tone of a man who was genuinely surprised rather than staging an encounter. "Mr. Bancroft," she managed. "I'm sorry, I wasn't watching where I was going." "Neither was I," he said, which was generous since she was fairly certain he had been watching where he was going with perfect competence. He was carrying a paper-wrapped bundle that looked like supplies from the general store, and he had a quality about him in the morning light that was somehow different from Saturday, less the dramatic stranger who had just bid $100 for a brooch, and more simply a man who had errands in town. "I was going to look for you," she said, before she'd fully decided to say it. He waited without any urgency. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said. "What you did, I went to the bank this morning and paid off everything I owed. The house is mine outright now. I wouldn't have been able to do that without what you paid at the auction." "I'm glad it helped," he said. "Can I ask you something?" She had been thinking about this since Saturday and in the restless hours of the 2 nights since. "You can ask," he said. "Why? You don't know me. You had no reason to bid that amount and certainly no reason to give the brooch back. You spent $100 and got nothing from it." He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a person who takes questions seriously enough to actually think before answering them. "I saw your face when the auctioneer held up that pouch," he said, "and I've seen that expression before. My mother had it once when things were very bad and she was selling the last of my grandmother's silver. Something about it, it wasn't the expression of someone who wanted to be selling what they were selling." He stopped there and seemed to consider whether to say more. "That's all, really. I had the money. You needed the money. The rest seemed unnecessary." Lenora looked at him for a moment. "Where did you come from?" she asked. "I mean that as a practical question." "I haven't seen you in Caldwell before Saturday." "Texas," he said. I've been running cattle up the Kishom Trail for the last 4 months, this being the end of the season. I've come up to Caldwell to collect the payment from the buyer here before I head back south." He paused. "Or that was the plan. Or that was the plan," she repeated, picking up the slight qualification in his words. "Are your plans changing?" "I'm not sure yet," he said, and he looked at her with that same thoughtful quality he'd had across the auction crowd, like a question he was considering very carefully. "Caldwell is not a bad town. I've been through here before, though I've never stayed. This trip might be different." "What would make it different?" she asked, and she was surprised by her own directness, which was a quality she generally kept well managed. She was also aware that she was still standing on the corner of 2nd Street, and that this was a small town where conversations were noticed and discussed, but she found that she did not particularly care this morning, which was unusual for her. "Good company, possibly," he said, and there was nothing forward in how he said it, nothing presumptuous. It was stated with the same even manner he seemed to apply to most things, and it landed accordingly. She felt color rise in her face, which annoyed her. She was 26 and a widow, and had been managing her own affairs with considerable discipline for 2 years, and she was not given to blushing like a girl of 16. "If you're in town for a while," she said very steadily, "perhaps you'd allow me to thank you for what you did with a proper dinner. I'm a good cook when I have ingredients to work with." He considered this. "I wouldn't want to put you to any trouble. You just paid $100 to prevent me from selling my mother's brooch," she said. "The least I can do is make you a meal." Something in his expression settled, like a decision being reached. "Then I accept, Mrs. Boone. Thank you." They arranged it for Wednesday evening, and Lenora walked the rest of the way home telling herself very firmly that this was simply a dinner, that she was repaying a debt of gratitude to a stranger who had done a kind thing, and that the warm feeling currently occupying the space behind her ribs was nothing more significant than relief about the bank note. She almost believed it. She spent Tuesday buying provisions with part of the $40 she'd kept back from the bank payment, selecting with the care of someone who has been economizing long enough to know exactly what each purchase is worth. She bought a small roasting chicken from the farmer who kept a stall at the edge of town, and carrots and potatoes from her own still productive garden, and flour and butter, and a small quantity of sugar that she told herself she would have bought eventually regardless. She polished the 2 decent chairs she still owned and scrubbed the small kitchen table until it shone. She found her mother's embroidered table runner in the cedar chest under the bedroom window and pressed it out with the flat iron, and then stood back and looked at her small house and thought that it looked, if not prosperous, at least deeply cared for. Frank Bancroft arrived at 6 o'clock on the dot, which told her something about him, because the men she had known in her life sorted cleanly into those who arrived when they said they would and those who did not. He brought something with him, a small bunch of late prairie flowers goldenrod and a few asters wrapped in brown paper, which he presented with the same no-ceremony manner he seemed to bring to everything. "They're not much," he said. "I'm not entirely sure the etiquette for this situation." "They're beautiful," she said, and meant it, because they were not formal flower shop blooms but the kind of things that grew wild and free across the Kansas plains and held all that color and wildness in their petals. She put them in a jar on the table, and they made the small, worn room look somehow entirely different. He took off his hat at the door and hung it on the peg she indicated, and he did not make the particular kind of comment that some visitors made about the smallness or sparseness of her home, either the condescending sympathy variety or the forced cheerfulness variety. He simply settled into the chair she offered him with the ease of a man who was comfortable in most environments and looked around the room with genuine attention, the way a person looks at something they find interesting. "That's a nice piece," he said, nodding toward the shelf above the fireplace where she had placed the cameo brooch in its velvet pouch beside the jar of flowers. She was at the stove and glanced over her shoulder. "My mother's," she said. "I put it back out. It seemed like the right place for it." "What was she like?" he asked, and it was an easy question. the kind that an easy conversationalist asks to fill space, but his attention made it feel like something more. Lenora considered this as she checked the chicken, which was roasting beautifully and filling the small kitchen with a smell that made everything feel more like a home and less like a problem. She was very steady, she said finally. She was from a family in Ohio that believed strongly in doing things correctly and completely and without complaint. She wasn't cold, she was warm actually in her way, but she had a backbone you could use for a measuring rod. She paused. She would have sold that brooch herself 6 months ago and told me I was being foolish to wait. Maybe, Frank said, but you needed to be ready to let it go. That's different from being foolish. She looked at him over her shoulder again. You sound like you've had some experience with that distinction. Some, he said, and there was a quality to the word that suggested a particular kind of history without opening a particular kind of door, and she recognized the gesture of a private person and did not push. They ate with the lamp turned up and the October wind pressing softly against the window panes, and the conversation moved the way good conversation does without forcing, finding its own level, exploring territory naturally. She learned that he was from a place outside San Antonio, that he had been working cattle drives since he was 22, that he was 31 years old, and had come to driving cattle the long way around, via several years of working horse ranches in New Mexico territory. He had a directness about him that she found, after weeks of managing carefully phrased conversations with creditors and employers and neighbors, almost startling in its cleanness. He said what he meant and listened to what she said as though it mattered. She told him about Daniel, not everything, but enough. That he had been a decent man, a kind man, not a man who had planned to die at 32 of a riding accident on a morning that started like any other morning. That she had grieved him properly and that she now occupied the particular position of a young widow in a frontier town, which was a position that required constant navigation of other people's assumptions and expectations. People in small towns, she said, are very interested in what a widow does next. I imagine, he said. They have opinions, she said. Some of them are kind opinions expressed by people who genuinely worry. Some of them are less kind, but all of them involve a belief that a woman in my position is fundamentally incomplete and requires completion by some external circumstance. And what do you think? He asked. She thought about it honestly. I think I've spent 2 years proving that I am not incomplete, she said. I think I am quite tired. And I think that I have been so focused on the proving that I have perhaps forgotten some other things. What kind of things? She looked at the flowers in the jar on the table. Things that smell like goldenrod, she said, which was perhaps the most sideways she had ever said anything, and she was quite surprised to hear it come out of her own mouth. Frank looked at the flowers too and then back at her, and he smiled, a real smile this time, full and genuine, that reached everything in his face and made him look for a moment like someone who laughed easily and often when life permitted it. Mrs. Boone, he said, you are a very interesting woman. Lenora, she said, please. Mrs. Boone makes me feel ancient, and this meal doesn't call for formality. Lenora, he said, and there was something in the way he said her name, just the name, no adjustment or ornamentation, that felt like something important without being anything she could properly define. Frank, she said back in the same spirit. He stayed until 8:30, which was not improper by any measure but was longer than she had imagined the evening would last when she was planning it, and she walked him to the door, and he retrieved his hat from the peg, and they stood in the doorway with the cool autumn air coming in around them, and the stars very clear and close in the Kansas sky the way they always were out here, far from the light pollution of any serious city. Thank you for dinner, he said. It was the best meal I've had since Texas. Thank you for coming, she said, and for you know what for. The auction, he nodded. I'd do it again given the chance. She did not say what came to mind immediately, which was that she hoped very much not to be in that situation again. Instead, she said, how long are you staying in Caldwell? The cattle buyer, a man named Holbrook, is finalizing the paperwork this week. I'll be settled up by the end of it. "And then you go back to Texas," she said, which was a statement rather than a question. "That's generally how it works," he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded like a door he wasn't certain whether to open. Although he stopped. "Although," she said. He looked at her in the lamplight from the doorway, and he seemed to reach some internal decision that was visible in the slight straightening of his posture. "I'll be back in the spring," he said. "When the drives start again. Caldwell is on the route." "It is," she agreed. "Would you object to my calling when I come through?" She felt the warm thing behind her ribs again, and this time she did not argue with herself about what it was. "I would not object," she said. "Not in the least." He nodded, put his hat on, and walked down her front path toward the street. He turned once and touched the brim of his hat in a brief gesture that was both a goodbye and something she could not quite categorize. And then the dark took him, and she was standing in her doorway alone with the smell of goldenrod and roast chicken and cool October air. And she was smiling without having made any particular decision to smile. The week that followed held a quality that was different from the weeks that had come before it. Lenora went to her work at the Drover's Rest and completed her mending, and tended her garden against the coming frost, as she always did. But there was a lightness in the doing of things that had been absent for a long time. She ran into Frank twice more before the end of the week, once at the general store, and once quite accidentally near the livery stable, where he was seeing to his bay horse with the same kind of careful attention he seemed to bring to everything. Both times they talked for a few minutes in the easy way of people who have found, to their mutual surprise, that talking is not difficult between them. On Friday he found her at the laundry line behind her house, where she was hanging sheets in the pale autumn sun, and he leaned on the fence in the companionable way he had and told her that his business with Holbrook was concluded and that he was leaving the following morning. Something dropped in her stomach. "So soon," she said, and then wished she had chosen a less transparent response. "The drive needs to go back before the weather turns worse," he said, "and I've got obligations down south." He paused. "I meant what I said, though, about spring." "I know you did," she said. She took a sheet off the line and folded it in the automatic, practiced way of long habit, not looking at him while she did it. "Lenora," he said. She looked up. "I'm not a man who says things I don't mean," he said, "and I don't make promises I don't intend to keep. When I say I'll come back, I'll come back." She believed him. She was not sure, on the evidence of a week's acquaintance, that she had any logical basis for believing him, but she did, with a certainty that sat quietly and without drama in the center of her chest. "Then I'll look for you in spring," she said. He was quiet for a moment, watching her fold sheets. "It's going to be a long winter," he said. "They always are," she said, "but they end." He smiled at that, the full, genuine smile that she had only seen twice and already considered one of the better things about him. "They do," he said. "They always end." He left the next morning. She did not go to see him off because she thought that would be too much, and she was managing herself with the particular discipline she had always used in moments that threatened to overflow their proper containers. But she heard the sound of horses in the early morning hours when the town was still gray and quiet, and she lay in her bed and listened, and she thought about spring with a warmth that surprised her by its depth. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was a serious one, as Kansas winters tended to be. The cold came down from the north in November with the kind of intent that the plains seemed to produce uniquely, not simply cold, but cold with persistence, cold that came in waves and settled and did not move until it was good and ready. Lenora managed. She had always managed. But for the first time in several years, managing was accompanied by something that made it bearable in a different way. She had letters. Frank had left her an address, the postmaster's office in San Antonio, where she could reach him if she chose, and she had taken 3 days to decide whether she would write, and then sat down and wrote with the discipline of someone who means every word. His reply came in 6 weeks, which was reasonable given the distances involved, and it was 2 pages in a clear, even hand that told her about the drive back to Texas, about his family's place outside San Antonio, about a foreman named Hector who had known him since he was a child and had very decided opinions about everything. It was not a flowery letter. It was a Frank Bancroft letter, which meant it was direct and attentive and said precisely what he meant. She wrote back the same day she received it. They wrote all winter. The letters came every 4 to 6 weeks, long enough apart that she had things to say when she wrote, and the arrival of each one was an event that she acknowledged privately, and with somewhat more than the mild interest she attempted to project if anyone happened to be watching. She told him about the winter, about the small details of her life, the way Chester, the mule's former owner, had bought him back from her, and Chester had immediately reverted to his difficult temperament, which felt like justice, about the women at the church who organized a quilting circle and had included her in a way that felt genuine rather than performed, about the way the town looked under heavy snow, the particular beauty of the plains in winter that was genuinely beautiful if you had enough firewood and food, which she did, though it had taken work. He told her about San Antonio, about his family, a younger sister named Clara who was apparently a formidable person, and his mother who still lived on the family property and who had learned to ride at 60 after his father's death, because she refused to be dependent on horses she couldn't manage herself. He told her about the work of maintaining the ranch through winter, about Hector's ongoing opinions, about a dog named Requisite who had apparently decided Frank was his person and could not be persuaded otherwise. She felt, through the letters, that she was learning the shape of him, not just the surface, but the structure underneath, the way he thought, the things he valued, the particular quality of his humor, which was dry and quiet and entirely without malice. She thought about him more than was probably practical. In February, she received a letter that was shorter than usual, because he had been ill, nothing serious, a fever that had kept him flat for 2 weeks but had resolved cleanly. And there was something in the shorter letter, in the small note of apology for the delay and the deliberate minimizing of what had clearly been a worrying illness, that told her more about him than many longer letters had. He did not want her to worry. He had written as soon as he was well enough to write, which meant he had been thinking about the gap and what she might think of it, which meant he was paying attention to her state of mind across hundreds of miles of prairie, which was she folded the letter carefully and put it with the others in the cedar chest under the bedroom window, beside her mother's embroidered runner. Spring came in March, wet and enthusiastic and smelling of mud and new grass. The cattle drives would start up from Texas in April, making the long journey north along the Kishom Trail, and Caldwell would begin to fill again with the seasonal energy of a trail town, drovers and cattle buyers and gamblers, and the general atmosphere of purpose and transience that came with the drives. Lenora found herself watching the road south with a frequency that she considered somewhat undignified. He arrived on the 14th of April. She did not see him arrive, but she heard about it from Silas Hartwell's wife, Martha, who was one of those community-connected people who seemed to have knowledge of all arrivals and departures as a matter of course. "That Bancroft fellow is back," Martha said, stopping by the kitchen of the Drover's Rest where Lenora was working the lunch service. "The tall one from Texas came in this morning with a good-sized drive, couple hundred head." Lenora said, "Ah," in what she hoped was a neutral tone, and turned back to the pot she was stirring. She was at home by 3 that afternoon, having traded her afternoon kitchen shift with a colleague who owed her a favor, and she had just started considering whether to simply stay home and wait for him to come and find her, or whether the mature course of action was to. There was a knock at the door. She took a breath, smoothed her apron, and opened it. Frank Bancroft stood on her front step with his hat in his hand and a look on his face that told her with complete clarity that the winter of letters had done the same thing to him that it had done to her. He looked at her for a moment without saying anything, and she looked back, and the winter stretched between them like a thread pulled taut and humming with tension. "You came," she said. "I said I would," he said. "You did," she said. "Come in." He came in, and she put the kettle on, and they sat at the kitchen table where they had sat in October with the roast chicken between them, and they talked for 3 hours without any pauses that felt like silences. It was different from October. There was a depth now, built from months of letters, that made conversation feel like the continuation of something rather than the beginning. She knew, going in, that he took his coffee black and that he was quietly funny and that he had strong opinions about horses and gentler ones about people. He knew that she read everything she could get her hands on and that she could be stubborn in ways that occasionally surprised even herself, and that she laughed more easily than she let on. "Clara wants to meet you," he said at some point during the 3rd hour with the comfortable certainty of someone who has already established in his own mind that such a meeting will take place. Lenora looked at him. "Does she?" "I may have mentioned you in my letters home," he said. "And what did you mention?" He met her gaze steadily. "That I met someone in Caldwell last fall, that she was remarkable, that I was going to come back." She felt the warmth move through her entire chest this time, unhurried and sure. "What did Clara say?" "She said it was about time," he said, "and that I had better not manage it badly." Lenora laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, and the sound seemed to surprise him pleasantly, because he smiled the full smile that she had been thinking about intermittently all winter. "I like Clara already," she said. "I suspected you would," he said. "She has a backbone you could use for a measuring rod." She recognized her own description of her mother reflected back, and something moved in her eyes that she suspected he saw because he did not look away. Over the following weeks, with the cattle drive settled in around Caldwell and the town full of the energetic bustle of the season, Frank made a habit of calling on Lenora every few days in the evenings, and she made a habit of expecting him. And gradually the habit became a given without either of them making any formal declaration about what it was. He brought her things, occasionally, a book he had found at the general store, knowing she would want it, a small newspaper from Wichita with an article he thought she would find interesting. Small things, attention-shaped. She found in return that she saved things to tell him observations about the town, a particularly fine sunset she had watched from her back garden, the ongoing saga of a dispute between two of her laundry customers that had been unfolding entertainingly for 3 weeks. The town noticed, of course. Caldwell noticed everything. Martha Hartwell noticed with warm approval. Archibald Pruitt at the bank noticed with the expression of a man who disapproves of good things happening to people he has previously classified as liabilities. Most people seemed to take the view that it was a reasonable and even pleasant development, which was the most a small frontier town could reasonably be asked for. One warm May evening, they walked to the edge of town where the prairie opened up, because Frank had suggested it and she had agreed, and they stood in the long grass with the sun going down behind them, and the whole enormous Kansas sky doing what it did in spring evenings, filling with color in layers, orange to pink to purple to the first deep blue of approaching night. The cattle were distant shapes on the darkening land, and the air smelled of grass and the peculiar clean smell of a landscape that had been there long before any of them and would be there long after. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked. "The road, the driving, the constant movement." He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about most things. "I did," he said. "About 2 years ago I started getting tired of it. But there's an obligation involved. Hector has worked for my family since before I was born, and the drive is how we keep the ranch. It's not just something I do for the pleasure of it. But you'd stop if you could." "If I had a reason to be somewhere," he said, and he looked at her when he said it, and it was not an indirect statement, and she did not treat it as one. "Caldwell is a reasonable place," she said. "I've been thinking that," he said. "There's land available east of town, good grazing land. I've been looking at it." She turned to look at him because this was specific and concrete in a way that required looking at. "Have you?" "I have," he said. He was watching her with the same steady attention he had given her since the first moment at the auction, the kind of attention that felt like being genuinely seen rather than merely observed. I want to be honest with you, Lenora. I'm not a man who does things by small degrees when he's made up his mind. I've gathered that, she said. I've made up my mind, he said. About you, about wanting to be in the same place as you and not just for a season, but I'm aware that we've known each other properly for less than a year, and I'm aware that I'm asking you to think about something significant. She looked at the prairie. She looked at the sky. She thought about 2 years of managing alone, of patching boots and scrubbing pots and being afraid about the bank note. And she thought about a winter of letters and a man who showed up when he said he would, and listened when she talked and brought goldenrod because he had noticed she liked wild things. She thought about her mother, who had been a practical woman, and about the cameo brooch on its shelf, and about the particular quality of the light on a May evening in Kansas when you were standing next to someone who felt like the other half of a language you had been speaking alone. "Frank," she said. "Yes. I am not interested in small degrees either," she said, and she turned and looked at him full in the face. He reached out and took her hand, and it was deliberate and gentle and certain all at once, and she let him, and they stood in the tall grass with the Kansas sunset behind them and the dark coming on slowly, and there was nothing difficult about any of it. He kissed her for the first time on the porch of her small house at the end of that evening, with the stars out and the night sounds of the prairie town moving around them in its familiar rhythms. It was unhurried and warm and felt entirely like him, without performance, without uncertainty, just exactly what it was. She held onto his coat lapel and kissed him back. "Lenora," he said against her hair afterward. "Yes," she said. "I'd like to do this right," he said. "By which I mean I'd like to speak to you formally about what I'm thinking when you're ready for that conversation." "I'm ready now," she said. He laughed, surprised and real. "You're sure?" "I've been sure for 6 months," she said. "I was just waiting to see if you'd catch up." He pulled back enough to look at her face, and his expression was everything she could have wanted, warm and amused, and something that was perhaps the most honest face she had ever seen a person wear. "Will you marry me, Lenora Boone?" "Yes," she said, without any pause at all. "I will, Frank Bancroft." The practical matters were not trivial, as practical matters generally are not, but they were navigable, which is the thing about difficulties when you are not navigating them alone. Frank sold his stake in the Texas Drive to his partner, a man named Cowboy, at a fair price that he had negotiated over several letters during the remainder of the spring. Hector, the long-standing foreman, wrote a letter of his own to Frank that Frank described as containing roughly equal parts grief at losing Frank from the drive, satisfaction that he had finally done something sensible, and very specific instructions about what he expected in the way of a visit once things were settled. Clara wrote a letter directly to Lenora that was 3 pages long and full of the kind of personality that suggested she and Lenora would either be the closest of friends or the most entertainingly matched of adversaries, and which concluded with, "I am very glad he found you. He has needed someone with actual sense." Lenora wrote back to Clara that she looked forward to meeting her very much, and meant it. Frank purchased 40 acres east of town in July, a piece of land with a good natural spring and enough grass to support cattle and horses, and he spent the summer months working it with the focused energy of a man who has clear purpose. He was not building it alone. Caldwell had that community quality of frontier towns where people helped each other build things, because everyone had needed the help at some point, and it was understood as a kind of ongoing mutual debt. Men from town came on Saturday mornings to help raise the new barn, and Lenora appeared with food for everyone at midday, and the whole enterprise had a quality of beginning that she found, to her ongoing and slightly surprised delight, overwhelmingly good. She pinned her mother's cameo to her collar the day Frank came to meet her with the deed to the property in his hand, signed and official, and she showed it to him, and he looked at it with the particular attention he brought to things that were important and said, "She would have been glad," which was exactly the right thing to say. They were married on the first Saturday of September 1880, in the small Caldwell church that was somewhat too small for the number of people who apparently felt that this was an event worth attending. The minister, Reverend Gable, performed the ceremony with straightforward sincerity. Lenora wore a dress that Martha Hartwell had helped her sew from blue wool, because blue was good for autumn, and she carried a small bunch of late wildflowers, goldenrod and asters. Because what else? And Frank stood at the front of the church in a new dark jacket that had been pressed with great care, and looked at her coming down the aisle with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he has been walking toward for a long time. Silas Hartwell wiped his eyes when they exchanged rings, which delighted Lenora privately. Archibald Prout sent a card of congratulations that was correct and formal and probably, she suspected, had been written by his wife. Clara Bancroft had come up from San Antonio, making a substantial journey specifically for the occasion, and she was exactly as formidable and warm and wonderful as her letters had suggested, and she hugged Lenora after the ceremony with the full force of someone who had already decided they were sisters. The reception was held in the Drover's Rest dining room, which had been cleared of its usual furniture and set with tables, and someone had brought a fiddle and someone else had brought a guitar. And by the middle of the evening the music had started and the dancing had started, and the whole thing had the specific, unrepeatable quality of a genuinely good party in a genuinely small town where everyone is pleased about the occasion. Frank danced with her twice, which, given that he had admitted earlier in the week that dancing was not his strongest quality, was a gesture she appreciated enormously. He was not bad at it, he was steady and had good timing, but he held her very close during the second dance in a way that had less to do with dancing technique, and more to do with the fact that they had been circling each other with great propriety for months, and were now, formally and entirely, in a position where propriety had a different shape. "Mrs. Bancroft," he said, into her hair, as the fiddle played something slow. "Yes," she said, which was both an answer to her name and a continuation of a conversation they had been having since October in the dusty street outside Hartwell's General Mercantile. They moved into the house on the new property the following week. It was not, at this point, a large house. Frank had built it with his own hands and several good friends, and it had 4 rooms and a good fireplace and a covered porch on the east side that faced the prairie and caught the morning light. Lenora put her mother's cameo on the mantelpiece, where it caught the firelight in the evenings and glowed with the warmth of shell and gold. She put the cedar chest under the bedroom window as it had always been, and she put the embroidered runner on the new table that Frank had made himself from lumber that he was unreasonably proud of, and she arranged her small collection of books on the shelf he had built beside the fireplace, and she put the jar from her small house, the one that had held the goldenrod that first evening in October, on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where the morning light hit it. It felt, immediately and entirely, like home. The first Kansas winter they spent together was different from the winters before. This was not because the winter itself was easier. The Plains were entirely democratic about their weather, and applied it to newlyweds with the same enthusiasm they applied to everyone else, but because they were not alone in it. The cold came in November and settled, and the land went white and the sky went gray, and in the evenings they sat by the fire and Frank read while she mended or sewed or occasionally read herself, and the silence between them was of the kind that is not empty but full, companionable and warm. He was, she discovered, an excellent partner in the practical matters of life. He did not have the assumption, which some men of that era had as completely as breathing, that the work inside the house was entirely hers and the work outside was entirely his. He chopped wood and she cooked. She mended and he repaired the equipment. They both tended the animals and they both, in various configurations and depending on the day, cleaned the house and managed the garden and made the 1,000 small decisions that a working household requires. It was not something they had discussed or negotiated. It had emerged simply from who they each were, and it made every day feel like something they were building together rather than two people occupying the same space in parallel. She told him this one evening in January when the wind was doing its full plains performance against the windows and they were warm and lit by the fire. "My mother ran the ranch as much as my father did," he said. "I grew up thinking that was how it worked. It should be how it works," she said. "It should," he agreed, with the simple conviction that made her love him. She realized, sometime in February of that first winter, while she was standing at the kitchen window watching him come in from the barn with his coat powdered with snow and his breath making fog in the cold air in his face, when he looked up and saw her in the window, breaking into the warm, unguarded smile that was one of the great reliable things in her world, that she loved him enormously, with the particular fullness of love that is not urgent and dramatic but steady and all-pervasive. The way the prairie was all-pervasive, the way good things settle into the structure of your days until you cannot quite imagine the structure without them. She told him this the same evening after dinner, in the direct way that had become natural between them. He looked at her for a moment in the lamplight, and then he took her hand in both of his and pressed it to his lips in a gesture that was entirely unlike him in its formality and entirely like him in its sincerity, and he said, "I loved you from that auction, Lenora. Before I even knew your name. I saw you and I thought, there is someone who deserves better than what's happening to her right now." "You didn't know anything about me," she said. "I know," he said, "but I thought it anyway. And now you know me," she said. "And now I know you," he said, "and I was right." Their son was born on the 22nd of October, 1881, exactly 2 years, nearly to the week, from that Saturday afternoon outside Hartwell's General Mercantile. They named him James, for Frank's father and for the uncomplicated foursquare quality of the name, which suited both of them. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when the air was just turning cool with the first breath of autumn, and the prairie grass was going gold, and he was loud and emphatic about his arrival in a way that the midwife, a capable woman named Delphine, described as promising. Frank held him in the first minutes of his life, with an expression that Lenora would remember for the rest of her own life. The expression of a man confronted with something so much larger than his prior understanding that his face simply could not contain any of the usual defenses he kept there. He looked entirely open, entirely present, with James's small, red, furious face against his chest, and his large, careful hand spanning the whole of the baby's back. "Hello," he said to his son in a very quiet voice. "We've been waiting for you." Clara came up from San Antonio in November, making the trip with the same cheerful determination she brought to everything, and she spent 3 weeks in the guest room that Frank had added to the house in the spring, and she held James with the practiced ease of an aunt who had decided in advance to be the best possible version of one, and she and Lenora talked for hours while the baby slept, talking the way women talk when they have found in each other something genuinely worth speaking to about everything. About nothing, about the great and small things of life on the Kansas plains, about Frank and his particular qualities, about the future. "He's happy," Clara said one evening, when James had gone to sleep and Frank was in the barn doing the last checks of the day and they were sitting by the fire with their tea. "I haven't seen him like this. I didn't know he could be like this. He was like this when I first met him," Lenora said. "He just had nowhere to put it." Clara looked at her with an expression that was very warm. "My mother is going to adore you," she said. Frank's mother, Edna Bancroft, made the journey up from San Antonio the following spring, which was a more significant undertaking but which she appeared to treat as a minor logistical matter. She was a compact, energetic woman of 58 who did indeed ride her own horse with complete command, and she swept into the Bancroft homestead east of Caldwell like a warm wind from the south, and held her grandson and approved of the house, and looked at Lenora with assessing eyes for approximately 10 minutes before apparently concluding that her assessment was complete and favorable. "I hear you nearly had to sell your mother's brooch," she said to Lenora on the second day of her visit over breakfast. "I did sell it," Lenora said. "Frank bought it and gave it back." Edna looked at her son with an expression of maternal satisfaction that was entirely uncomplicated. "Good," she said. "That was the right thing." "I thought so," Frank said mildly. "You were raised correctly," Edna said, which appeared to be the end of that assessment. She stayed for 2 weeks and left with clear intention of returning, which she did, twice a year after that, and James grew up knowing his grandmother as a regular and substantial presence, a person who taught him to ride a horse with the same thoroughness that she had applied to teaching herself. The ranch grew in the years that followed, steadily, and with the particular pace of things that are built carefully rather than quickly. Frank added cattle to the operation, good stock, managed with the knowledge of a man who had spent his adult life understanding the business from every angle. He brought Hector up from Texas in the 3rd year, which Hector arrived for with the air of someone who had been waiting to be asked, and had decided views about what needed improving, and Hector's views were frequently correct, which Frank acknowledged with the straightforward honesty that was one of his best qualities. Lenora worked the garden and the household, and eventually, by the 4th year, had taken over the management of the accounts, because she had a head for figures and an organizational capability that she had first demonstrated by surviving 2 years as a widowed woman with a bank debt in a frontier town, which is, in fact, an excellent preparation for managing ranch finances. Frank handed this responsibility over without any drama, because it made clear sense, and because the particular man he was did not require that a task be his simply because it had historically been done by men. She also, in that 4th year, began teaching reading to several of the children of the ranch workers' Mexican families who had come north with Hector, whose children were bright and eager, and had no school to attend on that side of Caldwell. She taught them on Saturday mornings in the kitchen, which became crowded and warm and frequently loud, and she loved it in a way that surprised her with its depth. She thought about injustice, in those mornings about the specific kind of injustice that means a child cannot learn to read because of where they were born or what language their parents spoke, and she thought that if she could fix one small corner of that particular wrong in one particular kitchen on the Kansas plains, it was worth doing. Frank built her a 2nd room onto the house for it, in the 5th year, with proper windows so there was good light for reading. He did not make it into a statement. He simply noticed what she was doing, understood its value, and made it easier. She kissed him in the middle of the construction project, with sawdust on his jacket, and he said, "What was that for?" And she said, "For being exactly who you are." And he said, "I hope that continues to be sufficient." And she said, "It is more than sufficient, it is everything," which was the most directly romantic thing she had said in several years, and which he received with both happiness and slight embarrassment, which was entirely characteristic. Their daughter arrived in the spring of the 5th year, a loud, willful, entirely perfect girl they named Mary Eleanor for Lenora's mother, and they called her Ellie because it suited her from the first moment. She had Frank's eyes, the amber-brown ones that went warm in good light, and she had Lenora's precision and stubbornness, and she was, from approximately 4 months of age, extremely clear about her own preferences. James, who was 4 when Ellie arrived, treated this development with the mixed enthusiasm of a child who has been promised something wonderful and is slightly uncertain whether this is what wonderful looks like. He came around entirely within a week, at which point he adopted a proprietary interest in his sister that would not diminish appreciably over the following years. The cameo brooch stayed on the mantelpiece, except on Sundays, when Lenora wore it pinned to her collar for church in the way that her mother had worn it, not as display but as acknowledgement, a small private salute to the women who had come before. She had told Ellie about it by the time Ellie was old enough to ask about the beautiful thing on the mantel, with the woman's face carved in ivory and the gold frame, and she had told her about her grandmother Eleanor, who had been a practical woman from Ohio with a backbone you could use for a measuring rod, and about the auction in front of Hartwell's General Mercantile, and about how a tall man from Texas had bought it and handed it right back. Why did he give it back? Ellie asked. She was perhaps 5, sitting on Lenora's lap in the lamplight. Because he saw that I needed the money but not the reason, Lenora said, which she knew was too philosophical for a 5-year-old but said anyway. What does that mean? Ellie asked. It means he understood the difference between what you have to give up and what you should give up, Lenora said, and he helped me keep the things that mattered. Ellie thought about this with the focused attention she brought to everything, which was entirely her father's quality showing through. And then you married him, she said. And then I married him, Lenora confirmed. Because he gave it back, Lenora smiled. Because of everything, she said. He gave it back, and then I found out who he was, and it turned out he was someone worth marrying. Ellie nodded, apparently satisfied with this as an account of how love worked. I want someone like that, she announced. You have a great deal of time before you need to think about that, Lenora said firmly. Frank, who had been in the doorway for the last portion of this conversation and had not announced himself, said from the doorway, She's right, Ellie. You have years. Ellie looked at her father with the expression she wore when she felt she was being managed. Years, she repeated skeptically. Many years, Frank said. Come to bed. Lenora laughed, and the lamp made everything warm, and the prairie outside was quiet under the Kansas stars. And it was one of those evenings that does not require anything particular to be happening in order to be entirely, completely, perfectly sufficient. The years moved forward with the particular quality of years that are full of living, not without difficulty, because that is not what life provides, but with the depth and texture of days that are genuinely inhabited. There were droughts that tested the pasture and required careful management of the cattle. And there were winters that came harder than expected and required the kind of collective community effort that Caldwell was, fundamentally, good at. There were illnesses that frightened and then passed, and there were disagreements between Frank and Lenora that were occasional and real, and were navigated with the particular skill of people who had been honest with each other from the start, and had learned that honesty, applied with care, is what lets disagreements resolve rather than accumulate. Frank was ill in the 7th year, a lung fever that came in February and refused to leave quickly, that kept him in bed for 3 weeks and moved through the house like a presence that nobody acknowledged directly, because to name it too loudly was bad luck. Lenora managed the ranch and the children and the household, and sat beside him in the evenings when the children were asleep with her hand in his, and she told him stories about the things that were happening on the ranch, about James who had just learned to read with the determined competence of a child who takes abilities seriously, about Ellie who had decided that she wanted to learn to ride and had been negotiating this with Hector with a strategic sophistication that Hector found both frustrating and impressive. She'll be fine, Frank said, on the 14th day, meaning Ellie on the horse question. That's not what I'm worried about, Lenora said. He looked at her. His face was thin from the illness which she hated with a helpless, specific intensity. I know, he said. I'm going to be all right, Lenora. You don't know that. I have an excellent reason to be all right, he said. Several reasons, 4 that I can name immediately. She looked at him. Only 4, something softened in his face. Lenora. Yes, come here, he said. She moved to sit beside him on the bed, and he put his arm around her, which took more effort than it should have, and which he pretended it did not. And she settled against him with her head on his shoulder, and she thought about October 1879, and a dusty auction, and a tall man at the back of the crowd who had spent $100 for no sensible reason, and had handed the result directly back to her. And she thought that the distance from that moment to this one was both vast and entirely short, and that she would not trade a single day of any of it. He recovered, as he had promised. By March he was up and moving. By April he was back to full work, and Hector told him with great directness that he had aged everyone on the property by approximately 5 years, with his stubbornness, about not calling the doctor sooner, which Frank received with the same straightforward acknowledgement that he brought to most legitimate criticisms. The second decade of their marriage held a sweetness of a different quality from the first, not the vivid sweetness of new love, but the deeper, more rooted sweetness of established love, of love that has been tested and has proved its structure. James grew into a young man who was like his father in many ways and like his mother in others, steady and direct, with a quiet humor and a serious eye for horses and land, and also a great lover of books that he had clearly gotten from Lenora, and which he tried, occasionally, to downplay in front of the ranch hands, with limited success. Ellie grew into a young woman who rode with the expert ease that came from Hector's instruction and Edna Bancroft's example, and who read everything in the house and had opinions about all of it, and who was, at 14, already negotiating her world with a combination of warmth and strategic intelligence that made both her parents somewhat awed and occasionally outwitted. Lenora's Saturday reading sessions had grown over the years into something that more closely resembled a small school, and she had, with some considerable effort and several letters to the county school board, managed to formalize it enough that it was recognized, which meant that the children she taught received proper educational acknowledgement for what they learned. It was not a simple process, and it involved a conversation with Archibald Prout, who had a role on the county board, that tested her patience and required Frank to be physically present solely to keep Prout honest, but they prevailed, and the small school continued and eventually outgrew the added room and required Frank to build yet another addition, which he did with the same cheerful absence of fanfare with which he did everything significant. "You have built a lot of rooms for me," she said, watching the construction on an autumn afternoon with a cup of coffee warming her hands. "I keep expecting you to run out of things to fill them with," he said from the middle of a frame of new lumber. "You've met me," she said. He grinned. "I have," he said. "I should have built more rooms to begin with." On the evening of their 15th anniversary, the first Saturday of September 1895, Frank asked her to walk with him to the edge of the property, which was a thing they did occasionally when the evening was good and the children were occupied. They walked out through the gold-lit autumn grass, past the cattle that grazed in the late light, to the rise where the land opened up to the full expanse of the Kansas sky. It was the same kind of evening that it had been in May of 1880, when he had told her he was looking at land and she had told him she was not interested in small degrees, and he had taken her hand in the tall grass. The sky was the same enormous, layered thing, orange to pink to the approaching blue of night. He had brought something with him, which she noticed after a moment, a small flat package in brown paper. "What is that?" she asked. "A thing I had made," he said, and he handed it to her. She unwrapped it in the evening light. It was a frame, a simple, beautiful silver frame, and inside it was a piece of paper on which someone with a steady, careful hand had written out, in good ink, the inscription from the back of her mother's brooch, "For my Eleanor who holds the morning." She stood holding it and looking at it for a long moment while the sky went through its colors above them. "I had the jeweler copy it," Frank said. "I thought you might want to be able to put it somewhere you could see it." Without taking the brooch off the mantel, she looked up at him, and she was not managing her face particularly, and she did not try to. "Frank Bancroft," she said. "Lenora Bancroft," he said, with the slight, warm correctness of a man who has always liked saying her name. She put her arms around him and he held her, and the prairie evening held them both, and she thought about her mother and about the inscription and about morning, and about all the mornings she had had in this life on this land with this man and all the mornings still to come, and she thought that the person who wrote that inscription had understood something important, that the people we love are the ones who hold the light for us, who carry it forward when we cannot, who hand it back when we need it most. She held the frame against her chest and looked up at the stars beginning to appear, one by one in the darkening sky. "Thank you," she said. "For 15 years, he said. "The thanks are entirely mutual." They walked back to the house through the grass with the prairie night coming on softly around them, and the lights from the windows made warm squares in the dark. And inside were James, now 14 and tall and serious, doing his lessons at the kitchen table, and Ellie, 12 and vivid and inevitable, arguing cheerfully with Hector about something through the back door, and the smell of supper that James had apparently started because he had noticed the time and done the sensible thing. And the cameo brooch on the mantelpiece catching the lamplight. She put the silver frame on the shelf beside the brooch, where the morning light would hit both of them. The years moved forward as they do. James grew up and stayed with the land he had grown up on, adding his own knowledge and effort to what his father had built. Ellie, as Lenora had always suspected she would, took her considerable abilities in several directions at once. She traveled. She learned. She returned with new ideas that she argued for with the precise, warm stubbornness of a person who has been listening carefully since childhood and has formed excellent opinions. She married a good man when she was 23, a schoolteacher named Garrett who had the patience for her and the intelligence to appreciate what that patience was in service of. And Frank walked her down the aisle of the same Caldwell church where he and Lenora had been married, in a suit that was better than the one he had worn that day, but otherwise very much the same kind of straightforward, dark, carefully pressed garment. Edna Bancroft came up from San Antonio for Ellie's wedding, at 74, on her own horse, because she saw no reason to change a working approach. Clara came, and her husband and their 3 children, who were by now young adults, and who received Ellie into the family with the warmth that was apparently a Bancroft characteristic. Lenora stood beside Frank at the church and watched their daughter take her vows, and thought that this was one of the things she had not known how to want when she was standing in front of Hartwell's General Mercantile with a velvet pouch in her hands and $60 to find, that the future held this, specifically. A daughter who was everything she hoped for, a son who made her proud every day, a man beside her who had been beside her for 15 years, and whose presence was as constant and necessary as weather. She took his hand during the ceremony. He pressed hers back without looking down, in the automatic way of people who know each other's hands as well as their own. 2 years after Ellie's wedding, James married a woman from a farm family in Harper County, a quiet, capable woman named Rose who had a practical steadiness that James admired, and who thought James's seriousness was one of the finest things about him, which it was. Their first child, a boy they named Franklin after his grandfather, arrived the following year, and Frank held his grandson with the same expression he had worn with James and with Ellie entirely open, every usual defense absent, the face of a man who has been surprised by the magnitude of something he already thought he understood. "Hello," he said, in the same quiet voice, to the same small red face. "We've been waiting for you." Lenora stood beside him and looked at the baby and looked at her husband and thought that the word for this was abundance, not the abundance of things, but of meaning, of connection, of the specific density of a life that has been fully lived with the people you were meant to share it with. She was 42 years old, which was not old, though the mirror showed her the silver that was coming into her dark hair at the temples, and the lines around her eyes that were there from years of prairie sun and prairie laughter, and the fullness of days. She had been in this town since she was 23, had been widowed in it, had been afraid in it, had been rescued in it in the particular way that matters, not by being saved from difficulty, but by being given back the things that were hers, the things that made difficulty bearable. She had built something here, with her own hands and Frank's, and the hands of neighbors and friends and workers and children. And what she had built was not a building or a ranch or a school, though it was also all of those things. What she had built was a life, full and purposeful and rooted, shot through with love in the way that a piece of good cloth is shot through with color, not on the surface but all the way through. She took the cameo off the mantelpiece that evening and turned it over in her hands, reading the inscription on the back, "For my Alina, who holds the morning." She thought about her grandmother who had given it to her mother. She thought about her mother, who had pressed it into her palm with a grip that was fierce and frail at once. She thought about herself, 26 years old and afraid, standing in front of Hartwell's auction, and about the stranger at the back of the crowd who had seen her face and done the exact, specific thing that had changed everything. She went to find Frank. He was on the porch, watching the evening come in over the prairie with the comfortable ease of a man who has a long, settled relationship with the view from this particular porch. He looked up when she came out and moved over on the bench to make room, and she sat beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they watched the light go out of the sky together in the unhurried way of people who have been watching skies together for long enough to understand that they will have more of them. "I was thinking," she said after a while, "about the auction." "First Saturday of October, 1879, he said. She looked at him. "You remember the date?" "I remember everything about that afternoon," he said. "The light, the smell of the dust, the rooster that nobody wanted," she laughed. "The rooster. And you," he said. "Standing there with your hands clasped, watching that pouch like you were trying to decide whether letting it go was going to break something in you." She was quiet for a moment. "It would have," she said. "Broken something, I think I knew that." "I think you did," he said. "Why did you do it?" she asked. She had asked him this before in various forms over the years, and his answers had been consistent, but she liked hearing them because they were, each time, precisely him. "Because it was the right thing," he said. "And because I looked at you and I thought, I want to know who she is. And did you find out?" He looked at her in the evening light, with the amber-brown eyes that she had first noticed in an afternoon crowd 16 years ago, and he smiled, the full, complete smile that she had thought, in October 1879, was one of the better things about him, and that she had subsequently confirmed was one of the better things in the world. "Lenora," he said, "I am still finding out." She kissed him on the porch of the house they had built together, with the prairie dark coming on and the stars appearing one by one above the enormous Kansas sky, and the lamplight from the windows behind them warm and steady as everything they had made. And she thought that this particular moment, this particular man, this life, was the truest and best thing she knew. The cameo brooch stayed on the mantelpiece, and when Ellie's daughter was born, a bright, dark-eyed girl they named Nora, for her grandmother, Lenora told her the story too, about the auction and the velvet pouch and the $100 and the man at the back of the crowd who had bought it and handed it right back, about the goldenrod, about the letters through the winter, about the evening on the prairie with the Kansas sky doing all its best work, and a man who said, "I have made up my mind," and meant it, and proved it every day after. Nora, at 4 years old, sat in her grandmother's lap with the brooch in her small hands, turning it carefully, and said, "That man must have loved you very much." And Lenora looked across the room at Frank, who was reading in his chair by the fire with the unconscious ease of someone who has sat in that chair for 20 years and considers it essentially part of himself. And Frank looked up, as he always seemed to when she was looking at him, and he raised an eyebrow in the small, warm question of a man who wants to know what she is thinking. "Yes," Lenora said, to her granddaughter and to herself, and to the whole of the life she was living inside. "He did. He does." The fire burned steadily, and the prairie wind moved outside in its ancient way across the grass, and the cameo on the mantel caught the light the way it always did, holding the morning, even in the evening, even after all the years, catching everything that mattered and giving it back whole.